For this showdown between Game of Thrones Season 1 and House of the Dragon Season 1, we're going to compare these two shows in 5 categories and see which ones they exceed in. It may be pretty obvious to some people that Game of Thrones Season 1 is better, but how does it stack up against the beginning of House of the Dragon? And how close are they in terms of quality and how they started their own shows? So first, let's dive into the efficiency of setting up story elements.
Fight!
Both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon have to do a lot of setup since the world of Westeros is massive and there are dozens of characters that are integral to the plot. These are introductory seasons, so the biggest obstacle from a writing standpoint is to educate the audience, but not in a boring manner. This includes all the characters, the different houses, political allegiances, motivations for the characters, and geography. So any show taking on this task is extremely difficult. Once you venture into the territory of too much exposition, you'll quickly lose your audience to boredom. Both GoT and HOTD don't fall into these pitfalls and handle their setup extremely well. Between the two shows, I think Game of Thrones takes on the bigger burden since there are more characters, and they have to deal with more perspectives and subplots around the world. After the first couple of episodes, it splinters into Ned and King's Landing, Tyrion getting taken to the Vale, Jon Snow at the Night's Watch, and Robb Stark and Bran back in Winterfell. It's a lot harder to juggle multiple plot lines than having a couple of main ones that follow a few key characters. You have to balance each episode and make them feel satisfying despite only having a very limited amount of time, along with having just enough time to build up each subplot to have a good resolution by the finale. As opposed to House of the Dragon, where each episode has one general arc that everyone goes through together, and you don't really have to worry about balancing a bunch of different perspectives. Because from a writing point of view, you have to be very particular about how much screen time each subplot will require. I wouldn't say that either of these methods of storytelling is better than the other, but Game of Thrones has to tell a more expansive story with like 5 plot lines, and that even gets more numerous later on. Then there's also the factor of more characters, and by having more characters, that then introduces the need to set up new houses and political allegiances. In House of the Dragon, you really only need to know about the Targaryens, the Hightowers, the Strongs, and the Velaryons. Meanwhile, in Game of Thrones Season 1, the houses that are integral to the story include the Starks, Baratheons, Lannisters, Targaryens, House Aaron, and 2 other cultures that aren't houses but are still relevant like the Night's Watch and the Dothraki. GOT Season 1 is naturally more ambitious in terms of its scale, and because of that, I think it deserves some extra points within this category. So now the question arises in that, which show executes its given introductory material better? And to me, that's pretty much equal. I think both shows expertly make their setup intriguing, and they do it in slightly different ways. For Game of Thrones, they do have more traditional form of character introductions, and there is expository dialogue. However, they quickly hook you into the show with an engrossing mystery and an insane plot twist of Bran getting pushed out of a window, along with the opening scene being the literal definition of a hook, where the first thing you witness is the White Walkers. Right away, you're given a taste of what's to come and the larger conflict within the world, so any exposition you may get bogged down by is instantly forgiven by the story getting a major catalyst that sparks the interest of the audience. And the exposition we do get within the first couple of episodes is always interesting and is quickly and efficiently done. Some examples include Ned Stark executing the deserter who ran away, which both pays off the first scene and sets up the code of honor that Ned lives by. The archery scene, where we quickly learn the dynamic between most of the characters through primarily actions and expressions, like these quick glances between Catelyn and Jon. And most of the dialogue is more personally driven that has a lot of subtext, like Robert talking about how much he loved Lyanna, and Tyrion talking with Jon. For Tyrion, he's not giving a monologue that introduces himself, but instead, the advice he gives and how he acts around Jon and others gives us a perfect illustration as to who he is, and we can quickly put together that he's a black sheep of the Lannisters. For House of the Dragon, it doesn't really feel like we get formal introductions, and the writers don't hold our hands. We get ushered into this story, and the writers don't make up any mechanics to naturally introduce us to everyone. Like how in Game of Thrones, Robert Baratheon ventures down to Winterfell, and each character essentially introduces themselves. And we have someone like Arya being obsessed with different characters, shouting out something like this.
That's Jaime Lannister, the Queen's twin brother.
Would you please shut up?
House of the Dragon's starting point feels like an ordinary day, and we're witnessing these characters carry out their normal business. And through this, in some minor form of conflict introduction, the characters immediately take their shape by how they react to it. along with the fact that the writers prioritize a select few main characters for the audience to really get to know, instead of trying to give everyone a moment to shine before they go off on their own adventures, like in Game of Thrones. There are multiple characters within the first episode of HOTD that the writers don't really bother to set up, and that's perfectly fine because the story isn't about them yet. House of the Dragon may not have a crazy turning point in the story, like a major betrayal to distract people from a lot of development, and the story focuses more on character-related drama. That's what the first season of House of the Dragon is focused on at the end of the day. So to say whether or not Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon is better at introducing story elements, I think it's about even. However, I'd give the slight edge to Game of Thrones for having to take on a bigger load in setting up material. Just barely because of this, Game of Thrones wins in this category. Since we talked a little bit about the story within the first couple of episodes, let's go into the general plot of these two seasons and see which one has the better story. As discussed prior, House of the Dragon is more concentrated on building characters and their stories, as opposed to the plot constantly going crazy. Then for Thrones, it does put a lot of focus on characters, but the story does go on a wild ride. For the first 4 seasons, the plot is like lightning in a bottle and is more than perfection. It's always going down surprising directions, it's very unpredictable, and every plot twist drastically changes the landscape to the point that the show keeps evolving. House of the Dragon is more straightforward in comparison, which is obviously not a bad thing, but when compared to Game of Thrones, it's kind of rough. Because in terms of plot twists that drastically change the story, we have the death of Sir Harwin, the death of Lucerys, and technically the fake-out death of Sir Rhaenyra. All of these events change the story to a big degree, and there are other shocking moments like the death of Vaemond, but that doesn't have as big of an impact as you may think. He dies, and the story doesn't change that much as a result. And that's not to say it's a bad moment, and it was great. When looking at Game of Thrones Season 1, we have Bran getting pushed out of a window, Catelyn kidnapping Tyrion, Jamie attacking Ned, Ned finding out the truth about Cersei and Jamie, Bobby B getting killed, Ned getting betrayed, his death, Viserys' death, Khal Drogo's death. The season is flat out stacked, and there are even more than the ones I listed, but I physically can't keep going because I'm running out of breath. The twists are so massive and even shake up the storytelling medium, like killing the main character. It's just staggering how many plot twists George R.R. Martin was able to cram into this season, and it's even crazier how he's able to keep this up over the next 3 seasons. Now, the reason why I'm focusing so much on plot twists is that both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon perfect every other story element to the point that I have to find some major differences to set them apart. Another one of those differences in favor of House of the Dragon is that I think the depth of character work is a bit deeper. I don't think this gap is as big in relation to the plot twist gap, but there are certain character arcs like Viserys' that hits an emotional depth that GOT Season 1 doesn't get to. It has the death of Ned Stark, and that was very shattering, but that's more of a shocking twist rather than character building. The death of Viserys isn't necessarily the sad part, and instead, it's a slow deterioration of his body and overall image, and how that impacts his relationships. Seeing loved ones wither away is extremely depressing because it's basically a death that lasts a long duration instead of lasting one quick moment. With so much of that agonizing pain slowly building up over time, so does the amount of sympathy that surrounds them. Viserys' journey hits this narrative aspect to a perfect T, along with the makeup department applying an astonishing amount of detail to his visual decay. From the color of his skin slowly changing, his hair starting to thin, his skin and body parts succumbing to rot, the way he walks, breathes, and acts are all so detailed to the point that it's one of the best performances within all of Game of Thrones. Then through all of this tragedy, we have a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's the absolute cherry on top, and that's the Last Supper. Words can't describe the amount of wholesome and sweet energy that radiate from this scene. Now, I should be saving all this for the characters category later on, but I think it's important to bring up the fact that House of the Dragon has some outstanding story-focused character development. If HOTD had this aspect along with some more game-changing plot twists, then I think it could match the first season of Game of Thrones. However, there is one more narrative aspect of House of the Dragon that brings it down a bit, and that's the time jumps. And it's not all of them. Doing time jumps is generally fine within storytelling, but when you are intentionally leaving out development in between that time that is crucial for certain story arcs, then you run into issues. The whole point of a time jump is to skip over a duration of time that doesn't have much plot progression. In House of the Dragon, it feels like the creators are more using time jumps because HBO refuses to make more than 10 episodes for a season. Because of this, there are consequences like plot threads not continuing and leaving the audience confused, or leaving out key character developments. This in turn tarnishes the payoff from these plot lines, and is the main reason why I think episode 6 is the worst of the season. This is a minor issue that primarily impacts one episode and a couple others, but we're comparing this to the masterpiece that is Game of Thrones Season 1. And there, I think the story is just way more captivating than it is in HOTD. It's a perfect storm of a murder mystery entangled in a web of political conspiracies, and this is just one of the plots of the first season. Jon, Dany, and Tyrion all have fun story arcs in this season, and all of these together along with the insane number of twists, make the general plot better than House of the Dragon. Let's take a break from talking about narrative elements and compare the production quality between these two seasons. Right away, it may be a little unfair because House of the Dragon has a budget of about $20 million per episode, while Game of Thrones had about $6 million per episode in Season 1. But I'm not going to hold that against Game of Thrones too much, and we'll try to take into account that they're playing at a disadvantage. If anything though, $6 million per episode in 2011 was still a big budget. The first production aspect that I think has the biggest difference is the cinematography. House of the Dragon looks much more cinematic than Game of Thrones. Shots have moodier lighting and seem more planned in execution. There's a sharp and warm color grade that seems like it has more contrast, and the black levels are a bit lower. The aspect ratio is different and has black bars instead of the full screen presentation. And lastly, it feels like there are more dynamic camera moves, whether that be rack focuses or dolly shots, and there are a lot more shots that incorporate a shallow focus that really submerges you into the acting. In the first season of Game of Thrones, visually, only a few scenes stand out to me, which are the execution of Ned Stark and how we were put into the headspace of Ned through close-ups, along with the audio design helping with that, Tyrion in the Sky Cell, which is uplifted by the VFX, and then Varys and Littlefinger talking in the Great Hall, which really doesn't have anything special shot-wise, and is mainly carried by the set piece and how grand it is. Most of these iconic visuals tend to have another aspect that carries them, while in House of the Dragon, ordinary dialogue scenes look gorgeous. I keep going back to this scene in episode 2 where Alicent consoles Rhaenyra by candlelight. The warm light that hugs their faces as they pour out emotions to one another is such a precious visual delight. And this isn't just one occurrence because House of the Dragon has a big collection of beautiful looking dialogue scenes. In almost every scene, there's at least one shot that sticks with me, whether it be this dolly shot on the beach, this unnecessarily artsy shot that spins around a cup while it's being filled, Alicent having her silhouette highlighted by the golden rays of sunlight, this close-up of Viserys' rotting finger, or literally any shot from the Dragonstone confrontation because the atmosphere is so tense with the fog and the sunset lighting. And hey, guess what? All these examples were pulled from just half of one episode, and I think that alone highlights the fact of how consistently great the cinematography is in this show. Game of Thrones in comparison isn't as impressive because it feels a lot more naturalistic. It doesn't feel like there's a cinematic color grade to it, and most of the footage is generally shot with a deeper focus. There's even a big visual difference if you go later into the show where there's more dramatic lighting, and everything else I mentioned while talking about House of the Dragon is present. For Season 1, there really isn't anything wrong with this style, and it gets the job done. It's just since we're comparing the style to something that's more cinematic, I think the cinematic option will be better. Looking at the VFX of Season 1, I think it still holds up extremely well, primarily because it's used to properly execute the scale of the world by showing off its fictional locations like the Wall and numerous exotic kingdoms. Season 1 is still able to pass as high quality television for today's standards, and even though they don't have massive dragons walking around, I think the VFX is still really good. The sets as well are still very impressive, and the first time you walk into the throne room, you are always blown away by how massive it is. Proportionally compared to House of the Dragon, since they have different budgets, I think Game of Thrones is pretty similar in terms of VFX and production design. Because on a technicality, House of the Dragon will always be better in these aspects because of the higher budget, but I think it's very commendable that Game of Thrones is able to give them a run for their money. There's also another small issue with GOT's smaller budget in the first season, and that's the fact that they weren't able to execute the battles. From a spectacle and action standpoint, it would have been really cool to see them, but I think from a narrative standpoint, David and Dan were still able to make it work. If anything, I think this again goes to show how rock solid the story is in Season 1. However, this round for production quality goes to House of the Dragon. One aspect between these two shows that I've been keeping track of is the dialogue, because House of the Dragon actually has some really well written dialogue, given that it doesn't have much in the source material. The way people speak feels accurate to the period and doesn't feel out of place. There are enough quotable lines that will keep anyone satisfied, and each character is expressed perfectly for the dialogue they are given, especially Daemon Targaryen.
She can have her answer now, stuffed in her father's mouth along with his withered cock. Let's end this mama's farce.
House of the Dragon, in comparison to most shows, blows them away, but when it comes to Game of Thrones, I think this is the golden standard for outstanding dialogue. In almost every scene, there will be a standout line that will immediately imprint on you. Just now, if I tell you to think about your favorite line in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, you'll probably immediately think of, "Love is the death of duty." A lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Or literally anything that comes out of Tyrion's mouth.
My brother has his sword, and I have my mind, and a mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone.
Since it's been like a month since the end of House of the Dragon, there aren't as many lines that have stuck with me in comparison to Game of Thrones. If you ask the same question to recount some of the best lines from HOTD, you'd probably be able to think of a few, but not as many as I'd expect for GoT. That's not to say that the iconic lines in House of the Dragon are worse in particular, I just think that George R. R. Martin outclassed the writers, and his usage of literary devices were amazing. Especially with Tyrion. The man just oozes so much wisdom, and the character on his own is a mouthpiece for some of the best dialogue in the show. Without Tyrion, then maybe House of the Dragon would have a slim chance, but I think Tyrion is like the Sir Barristan Selmy of fighting, but for dialogue. Every scene he is in, his dialogue puts you into a trance that makes you immediately fall in love with his character. Essentially a perfect combo for his personality and the writing surrounding him that masterfully brings him to life. The only character that comes close in House of the Dragon in terms of charm and charisma is Daemon, and he doesn't really have many iconic lines, unfortunately. Any seemingly good dialogue that surrounds his character is more carried by the great acting from Matt Smith. Meanwhile, in Game of Thrones, I'm always impressed by the intelligent and meaningful lines that are always jumping from the script. I am putting a lot of emphasis on iconic lines, and that's because I think both shows nail all other aspects for dialogue expertly, to the point that I essentially have to do an arms race for memorable lines. And when it comes to that race, Game of Thrones wins. So even though GOT wins in that aspect, I think HOTD still has great dialogue that is able to sit next to Game of Thrones without anyone feeling like there's a massive disparity in quality. For the last category, I wanted to save what I would think would be the most interesting one, and that's the characters. I'd also classify this category as being the most subjective because this category will be skewed more by which characters you are drawn to the most. To lay out some facts right away, Game of Thrones has more characters than House of the Dragon. And not just more side characters, but main characters too. Now, I wouldn't say that having more is better, because that means you have to divide your time much more across the show, instead of being able to focus on a select few main characters. However, I don't think any of the main characters are hurt as a result of this in Game of Thrones. They just may not hit the absolute highs that Viserys' arc was able to get to. Now, you can argue that Ned Stark would rival that, but I think the plot point of his death makes his character naturally more iconic than the character himself. Because when looking at Ned, he doesn't have as deep and expansive of an arc as Viserys does. He's a man of honor who chooses to go down the rabbit hole of the mystery of Don Aaron's death, and along the way, he meets his demise. The one thing that actually changed about his character was in the dungeons before his execution. He learns to drop his immense pride surrounding his honor, and chooses to try to save his daughters in an act that destroys what defines him. That's obviously great, but in comparison to Viserys, there's a lot more going on internally and even externally. A king who tries his hardest to continue the glorious reign of King Jaehaerys, but is constantly making mistakes that worsens the world around him. These mistakes define Viserys because he wants to make everyone happy to the point that he loses sight of the ramifications of his actions, like preemptively making Rhaenyra his heir, allowing the Stepstones to become a festering issue, choosing to be ignorant towards Rhaenyra having bastards, and allowing the divide between the Greens and the Blacks to grow. Viserys is constantly changing his mind, and seeing him reflect on his mistakes creates solid moments of character development. That layer of confidence in being king melts away, and we see this frail man who, like anyone else, regularly has regrets and sorrows. Our image of Viserys changes immensely from episode to episode, and in most of them, we tend to learn something integral tied to the essence of his character. I can go on for a while about Viserys, and I did go on for a bit in the general plot section, but to say the least, I think he's one of the most captivating leads between the two shows. The rest of the main characters in House of the Dragon, I don't think are able to get to the peak that Viserys was able to get to. Like, Rhaenyra had an intense journey through adolescence, and her adulthood was even more hectic. But I'd argue that Daenerys had just as good of an arc for season 1. Seeing her go from a fully suppressed and scared child to an independent woman who builds the confidence to stand up to the oppressive men around her and become a leader was a great journey. It may not go as in depth as Rhaenyra emotionally since she had more screen time. However, I think Game of Thrones is able to utilize that smaller amount of screen time for each of its main characters really well. Like Tyrion, Jon, Dany, Ned, Cersei, Jamie, Arya, and many more feel just fleshed out enough for the audience to love them, and it doesn't feel like anything is missing for us to understand what they are going through. Also, since the budget for the show is smaller, that means that most scenes tend to be dialogue scenes. So we actually have more time within the show for character building than we did in House of the Dragon, since there isn't as much action. I know I said that quantity of characters within Game of Thrones doesn't make it better than HOTD, but I think they were able to hit that hard goal of quantity and quality. While House of the Dragon has a smaller quantity, but just as much quality, and if not a bit more. I love Daemon, Alicent, Otto, Rhaenyra, and Viserys, but it essentially stops there for the S-tier characters. Also, since Game of Thrones naturally has more subplots, they are able to introduce more side characters without it feeling overwhelming. Because if you have the same amount of characters in Game of Thrones for just 2 main plotlines like in House of the Dragon, then it will become very crowded. For this category, House of the Dragon is able to give Game of Thrones a run for its money, but ultimately, it's almost impossible to beat the perfect ensemble of characters for Game of Thrones. If they were able to give the rest of the main characters in HOTD an equally orgasmic character arc as Viserys had, then maybe it would be better than Game of Thrones Season 1. Even though House of the Dragon lost in 4 of the 5 categories, it came very close to matching the quality that is Season 1 of Game of Thrones. Given that the story is supposed to get even crazier in Season 2 of House of the Dragon, then I won't be surprised if it's able to exceed the greatness of Season 2 of GoT. Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments if you want me to do any more of these versus style videos.